Daniel Whitfield told his boss the jet needed a $35 part. She fired him for it. 24 hours later, that same boss's father handed Daniel 30% of a $340 million company in front of the people who had just watched him get walked out in handcuffs of humiliation, not steel. The Kessler G650 sat dead on the tarmac at Kessler Field, 14 miles outside Greenville, South Carolina. Its hydraulic panel kept flashing the same red fault code over and over, like a heartbeat monitor that refused to give good news. Behind the glass of the heated viewing room, 37 investors stood frozen, coffee going cold in their hands, watching a $28 million aircraft refuse to breathe. A reporter from the Greenville News had already lifted her phone. She wasn't filming the jet, she was filming the silence. Nobody in that room knew yet that this exact failure had already been solved once and undone on purpose. One day earlier, Daniel had knelt beneath that same aircraft with nothing but a flashlight and 11 years of instinct and told CEO Vanessa Kessler the fix wasn't complicated. One hydraulic bypass valve. Total cost, $35. Vanessa looked at the number. Then she looked at his worn work jacket, and in front of her entire board, she called him a mechanic chasing attention. She signed a $21 million systems overhaul instead, championed loudly by her operations director Bradley Coyne. Daniel's access badge was deactivated before he reached his truck in the parking lot. What no one knew was what he carried out with him, a small manila envelope marked only with the initials RK, pulled from behind a wiring panel nobody was ever supposed to open. He hadn't told a single person it existed. 9 minutes, that's how long Vanessa had left before every investor in that room walked out for good and made one call to the man she'd banned from the building a day earlier. 6 days before the tarmac went silent, Daniel Whitfield woke up at 5:20 a.m. in a rented duplex on the outskirts of Spartanburg, South Carolina, 42 minutes from Kessler Field. He made coffee in the same chipped mug he'd used for 6 years, checked on his 10-year-old daughter Grace, still asleep with one arm hanging off the bed, and left a granola bar on the counter in case she woke up before he got back. He drove a 2011 Chevrolet Silverado with 189,000 miles on it. The passenger door didn't lock right, so he kept a bungee cord looped through the handle. In the truck bed sat one steel toolbox, corners dented, his late father's initials, R.W., still carved in the lid with a pocket knife. Daniel wasn't on Kessler Aviation's payroll. He was a contractor, the name they called when the in-house engineers ran out of ideas, which had been happening more since the company brought in newer, younger hires who trusted software readouts over their own hands. Nobody upstairs seemed to notice that Daniel was the one quietly keeping the fleet in the air. He never asked for a full-time offer. He billed his hours, fixed what needed to be fixed, and tried to be home before Grace's bedtime. Some months were tight. He picked up side work at a transmission shop off Wade Hampton Boulevard when Kessler didn't call, and he never mentioned the strain to anyone, not to Grace, not to his sister, who sometimes asked if he was doing okay. At the hangar, the staff were polite but distant, the kind of distant reserved for a man whose last name they never bothered to learn. Nobody asked where he trained. Nobody asked how many aircraft he'd saved from being grounded over 11 years. They just handed him the failures nobody else could explain, then walked away without a word. That morning, the call came in the same way it always did, a warning light on the G650 that the in-house team couldn't isolate. Daniel grabbed his toolbox, kissed Grace's forehead at the door, and drove toward Kessler Field with no idea that in less than 3 hours, Vanessa Kessler would look him in the eye and call him a man chasing attention.
Daniel reached Kessler Field a little after 8 a.m., just as ground crews pulled the G650 out of the hangar for its pre-check. Bradley Coyne met him near the boarding stairs, tablet already lit, talking before Daniel had both boots on the tarmac. A secondary hydraulic line was throwing intermittent warnings. The in-house engineers had been on it since 6 a.m. and had nothing. The aircraft needed to be clean for an investor demonstration in 6 days, and Vanessa wanted it solved fast. Daniel didn't say much back. He climbed into the service bay beneath the jet, knelt down, and pressed 2 fingers against the hydraulic line the way his father had shown him 31 years earlier, not reading a screen first, just feeling for the pulse of the pump through the metal. There it was, a small tremor, almost nothing, right where the line met a secondary valve. He worked slow, the way he always did, no guessing, no rushing. 18 minutes later, he had it. A bypass valve, stamped part number KX2209, had started sticking from fine metal shavings caught inside its seat. Nothing structural, nothing systemic, just one small part doing exactly what small parts do when nobody checks them. Standing behind him was Priya Anand, the junior engineer shadowing Daniel that morning. She pulled up the sensor logs and went quiet. The same fault pattern had shown up in the data 4 days earlier, and someone on the internal team had marked it resolved without ever tracing it back to the valve. Daniel told Bradley what he'd found. Replace the valve, recalibrate the pressure by hand. 35 minutes of work, total cost $35. Bradley's face didn't relax the way Daniel expected. It tightened, like the answer was too small to be trusted. That's it? $35 for a $28 million jet? Daniel nodded once. That's it. Bradley closed his tablet and walked toward the office without another word, and Daniel, still kneeling under the aircraft, felt the same quiet unease he'd learned to recognize over the years, the feeling that the day was about to go a different direction than the evidence pointed. By 10 a.m., Daniel stood in the executive conference room on the 2nd floor of Kessler Aviation Building, glass walls looking straight down onto the hangar floor. Vanessa Kessler sat at the head of the table in a tailored navy suit, flanked by Bradley Coyne, legal counsel Melissa Grant, Priya Anand, and 5 senior directors who mostly kept their eyes on their notepads. Bradley spoke first. He'd clearly rehearsed it. A full hydraulic cluster replacement, sourced through a vendor called Draymond Systems Group, priced at $21 million. He used phrases like redundant architecture and next-generation reliability, and an aircraft that will never throw another warning light again. The directors nodded along the way people nod when a number sounds expensive enough to feel safe. Then Vanessa turned to Daniel and asked him to explain his alternative. He kept it short. The aircraft didn't need a new hydraulic system. It needed one bypass valve, jammed with metal shavings replaced and recalibrated. 35 minutes, $35. Someone near the far end of the table laughed under his breath, like it was a joke instead of a diagnosis. Vanessa asked where Daniel had trained. He told her the truth. 11 years in Navy aviation maintenance, 11 more working private aircraft up and down the Southeast. No engineering degree, no plaque on a wall, just decades of hands-on failures diagnosed one at a time. It was the wrong answer for that room. A man with no diploma telling her a $35 fix was the answer for a $28 million jet in front of investors who'd arrive in 6 days expecting to see a company that spent boldly, not one that patched quietly. Bradley pressed his advantage. If Kessler Aviation gambled on a contractor's hunch and the plane failed mid-flight, the headline wouldn't be about the valve. It would be about a company that repaired million-dollar jets like a backyard mechanic. Daniel repeated, calm and even, that the issue was never about the price of the part. It was about choosing the right one. Vanessa heard enough. In front of the entire board, she said Kessler Aviation would not stake its future on a $35 patch. She picked up her pen and signed the $21 million contract with Draymond Systems Group. Daniel's access badge was deactivated before he reached the elevator. Before he left, he stopped by Priya's workstation near the hangar floor. He pulled the old bypass valve from his pocket, sealed in a small plastic bag, and set it in her hand. "If it still won't start, check this exact spot again," he said quietly. Priya didn't answer right away. She just looked at the bag, then at him, unsure what to do with either. Vanessa watched the exchange from across the hangar floor and said nothing. To her, it sounded like wounded pride talking, not a warning worth remembering. Outside, A light rain had started falling over the airfield. Daniel walked to his truck without looking back, climbed in, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. Not angry, just tired. The particular kind of tired that comes from being right in rooms that prefer confidence over evidence. He reached into his jacket and felt the manila envelope still tucked in the inside pocket, the one marked RK. He'd pulled it from behind the wiring panel that morning, wedged so deep it looked like it had been hidden on purpose rather than lost by accident. He hadn't opened it. Something about the way it was placed, flat, dry, deliberately tucked behind a support bracket instead of dropped, told him it wasn't trash. He decided it could wait until he was home, until Grace was asleep and the house was quiet enough to think. That night, Kessler Field didn't sleep either. Technicians from Draymond Systems Group arrived with crates of equipment a little after 9 p.m., floodlights burning over the hangar until well past 1 a.m. The G650 was taken apart piece by piece in a rush to rebuild it before the investor demonstration. Bradley stayed close to Vanessa the whole time, reassuring her the decision was right, that investors needed to see a company willing to spend boldly. Vanessa nodded along, though something underneath her composure didn't quite settle. Near midnight, Priya found a quiet corner of the hangar and opened the plastic bag under a work light. Exactly what Daniel described was sitting right there, a fine residue of metal shavings lodged where the seal should have closed clean. She started toward Bradley's office to report it. Bradley intercepted her in the hallway before she reached the door. His warning was short. Don't undermine the CEO's decision with a mechanic's theory. Remember whose signature carried weight in that building and whose didn't. Priya folded the bag back into her pocket and said nothing more, but the feeling in her chest didn't leave her for the rest of the night. At home, Daniel finally opened the envelope after Grace had gone to bed. Inside was a single handwritten maintenance log dated 11 years earlier, and a photograph of a much younger mechanic standing beside an early Kessler prototype. The name signed at the bottom of the log Daniel didn't recognize, but the handwriting looked familiar in a way he couldn't place, and one line, underlined twice, read, "Valve failure covered up, coin authorized parts substitution." Daniel sat with that for a long time before he finally understood he was holding something far more dangerous than a $35 diagnosis. 6 days passed in a hurry that felt like 6 minutes. By sunrise on demonstration day, the hangar had been transformed into something closer to a stage than a workplace. Dark cars lined the access road. Aviation journalists trailed in behind them. Kessler Aviation's senior staff stood in pressed suits along the hangar floor, coffee in hand, rehearsing the language of confidence they'd use for the next few hours. Vanessa climbed a small platform near the aircraft to address the crowd. She spoke about innovation, about reliability, about a company unwilling to settle for outdated thinking. Behind her, the G650 gleamed under the lights, polished to a shine that suggested nothing inside it had ever failed. At 7 a.m., the pilot began the startup sequence. The panel flashed a hydraulic warning instead of a clean confirmation. He tried again, same warning. On the third attempt, the system locked itself into a protective shutdown and refused to go any further, no matter how many times the sequence was repeated. The mood in the hangar shifted in seconds. Polished confidence turned to visible unease. Investors exchanged glances. The reporter from the Greenville News started writing, her pen moving faster than anyone on that platform wanted to see. Bradley moved fast, blaming the in-house engineering team first, then floating, almost casually, that Daniel Whitefield might have tampered with something out of resentment before he left. Vanessa felt her face burn with something between anger and humiliation. She ordered someone to get Daniel on the phone, not to apologize, but to confront him about what had gone wrong.
42 minutes away, in the small transmission shop off Wade Hampton Boulevard, Daniel took the call with no enthusiasm at all. The memory of being escorted out with a dead badge still sat heavy in his chest, and for a moment he considered saying no. A short phone call with Grace the night before had reminded him gently that steady work mattered more than wounded pride, even if it didn't erase the sting of how he'd been treated. He drove back to Kessler Field. This time, walking through the hangar doors, he didn't lower his eyes past the 100 stares, ranging from confusion to open suspicion. Vanessa met him at the base of the aircraft, her voice cold and clipped. If he believed himself right, she told him, he'd have to prove it here, now, in front of everyone who had just watched her promise collapse. She gave him 30 minutes. If he was wrong, he'd never work with any company connected to Kessler again. Daniel understood immediately. This wasn't an invitation to help. It was a public trial staged for an audience that had already half decided his guilt. He didn't rush. He asked first for the pressure logs recorded in the 12 hours after the Draymond install. The Draymond engineers smirked at the request, certain a $21 million system couldn't possibly be undone by a part that cost less than an hour of their labor. What the data showed was unmistakable. The failure was happening at the exact same pressure point as before. Nothing had actually been fixed. It had only been buried under new hardware. Daniel asked permission to open an access panel on the secondary compartment, the one the $21 million upgrade had never touched. Bradley objected immediately, arguing it fell outside the new system's scope. That's exactly why the failure's still here, Daniel said, because nobody's touched it. Vanessa, aware every investor in the room was watching her decide, allowed it. Behind the panel sat a small valve, tucked deep enough that almost no one had thought to look. Daniel explained it was sending a false pressure reading, triggering the shutdown every time. He pulled the original valve from his pocket, the one he'd left with Priya, and held it up. The metal residue and wear pattern matched exactly what he'd described 6 days earlier. Priya finally found her voice. In front of Vanessa and the entire board, she confirmed Daniel had identified the same issue nearly a week before, and that the data supporting it had been sitting there untouched the whole time. Vanessa looked at Priya, then at Bradley, and for the first time understood that something had been deliberately kept from her. Daniel broke the silence. He said he could get the aircraft running again, but only on 2 conditions: full access, no interference, and a guarantee that no junior technician would be blamed for decisions made far above their pay grade. Before Vanessa could answer, the side door of the hangar swung open, and every conversation in the room went quiet at once.
Walter Kessler walked in with the unhurried gait of a man who'd built this company with his own hands decades before his daughter ever sat at a head of a boardroom table. He rarely came to the field anymore, having stepped back years earlier to let Vanessa run things her way. His presence alone was enough to silence the room. He didn't look at Bradley. He didn't look at the investors clustered near the platform. His eyes went straight to Daniel, studying him for a long moment, like a man confirming something he'd suspected for a while. "You're a Whitfield," Walter said. "Your father worked the line on the old Kessler prototype, didn't he, out of the original hangar back in '95? Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "Yes, sir, Ray Whitfield. He was my father." Something shifted in Walter's face. He told the room, quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, that 31 years earlier, Ray Whitfield had caught a valve failure on an early prototype that would have grounded the company before it ever got off the ground. Walter said the fix was small, cheap, and nearly dismissed by the leadership at the time until Ray insisted and was proven right. He called it a rare instinct, the kind that repairs the smallest broken thing instead of replacing the most expensive one. He said this company had nearly thrown that instinct away twice now, 31 years apart. Daniel's hand moved to his jacket pocket, to the envelope marked RK. He hadn't planned to bring it. He'd brought it anyway, some instinct telling him it belonged in this room before the day was over. "Sir, I found something in the access panel, a log. It's got your initials on it, and your father's handwriting, I think, talking about a valve failure that got covered up, parts substitution, signed off by someone named Coyne. The room went still in a different way than before. Walter's eyes moved to Bradley, who had gone very pale very quickly. Melissa Grant, the legal counsel, had already pulled out her tablet before Daniel finished the sentence. Within minutes, she found what she'd half expected to find: an indirect financial relationship between Draymond Systems Group and a shell company registered under a name tied to Bradley Coyne's father, a name that traced straight back to a payout scandal the company had quietly buried 30 decades earlier, the same scandal the old maintenance log had documented in Ray Whitfield's own hand. Vanessa stared at the tablet, struggling to reconcile it with the man she'd trusted enough to sign a $21 million upgrade on his recommendation 1 day earlier. She hadn't just made a bad technical judgment, she'd been steered into it by a man whose family had been steering Kessler Aviation's decisions away from the truth for 31 years. Daniel went to work under the eyes of Walter, Vanessa, Melissa, and 37 investors who hadn't moved from where they stood. He pulled the faulty valve, cleared the contaminated line, installed the correct part, and recalibrated the pressure by hand. Nothing but basic tools and the same patience his father had taught him 31 years earlier. There was nothing flashy about it, just quiet, exact movement, the kind that made the Draymond engineers go silent one by one as they watched. Priya stayed close, finally allowed to help openly, finding something steadying in standing beside someone who told the truth even when it cost him something. As the system settled into calibration, Melissa kept working, cross-referencing Draymond's invoices against payment records filed under initial related department codes. Each document tightened the pattern further, not one lapse of judgment, but a repeated, deliberate effort to steer Kessler Aviation's spending towards companies that benefited the Coyne family directly, going back 30 decades. At 8:51 a.m., the pilot tried the startup sequence again. First checkpoint, clean. Second checkpoint, no warnings, no hesitation. A moment later, the auxiliary engine engaged, its low hum rising through the hangar like a verdict finally being delivered after a long, uncertain trial. The Kessler G650 ran steady, fully restored in under an hour for a part that cost $35. The investors who'd stood in stunned silence minutes earlier began to applaud, quietly at first, then with real conviction. Not because of a polished pitch, but because they just watched something far more convincing than one. Daniel didn't celebrate. He wiped his hands on a cloth, logged the final readings in a small notebook, and asked the technical team to monitor the system for 15 more minutes before clearing it for a real test flight. Bradley tried to slip toward the hangar door. Melissa intercepted him before he reached it, informing him, loud enough for the room to hear, that every contract tied to Draymond Systems Group was now frozen pending a full investigation. Vanessa turned to face the investors directly, something she had avoided doing all week. She told them plainly that the $21 million upgrade had never addressed the actual failure, and that the decision had been hers to make and hers to answer for. It was without question a public admission of failure. It was also the first honest thing she'd said all week. Daniel Whitfield identified the correct diagnosis 6 days ago, she said. I didn't listen. Daniel didn't use the moment to push further. He said only that the technicians working beneath senior management deserved protection from decisions made far above their pay grade, a statement that visibly steadied Priya and the other junior engineers standing nearby. Walter watched his daughter from a few feet away, recognizing in that admission exactly the kind of leadership he'd hoped this ordeal might finally teach her. As the Kessler G650 rolled toward the runway for its test flight, Vanessa turned to Daniel and asked him, without a trace of the condescension she'd shown him the day before, what he had seen that everyone else in that hangar had somehow missed.
Later that morning, in the founder's old office, a modest room left largely untouched since the company's early years, Walter sat down with Daniel and Vanessa and talked at length about Ray Whitfield, a gifted technician who'd once caught a problem the entire company tried to bury, only to be pushed out quietly so no one had to answer for it. The injustice of it had never fully left Walter's memory. Seeing the same instincts in Daniel had stirred something he'd carried, unspoken, for 31 years.
Vanessa asked why Daniel had come back at all after she'd humiliated him in front of 37 investors the day before. Daniel said if he hadn't, the aircraft would have kept getting repaired the wrong way. Junior technicians might have taken the blame for something they didn't cause, and her father's company might have lost everything it took 40 years to build. Walter slid a document across the desk. Not a check this time, a formal offer. 30% ownership stake in Kessler Aviation, effective immediately, contingent on Daniel staying on as head of technical integrity, a position created that morning and never filled by anyone before him. Daniel didn't reach for the pen right away. He said he'd only accept it if it came with one condition, a training program for young technicians, one that taught them to find the root cause before reaching for the expensive fix. Walter agreed without hesitation, telling him that was exactly the answer he'd hoped to hear. Melissa's investigation confirmed everything within days. Bradley knew the $35 diagnosis was correct before he pushed the $21 million contract through. Internal messages showed he'd worked deliberately to damage Daniel's credibility, to protect a financial arrangement 3 decades in the making. Vanessa confronted him in the same conference room where she'd dismissed Daniel 1 day earlier, laid the evidence across the table, and suspended him on the spot, referring the matter to legal counsel and an independent auditor. 3 months later, Whitfield Precision Systems opened its doors beside Kessler Field. Its bays ran with the same disciplined order Daniel had carried since he was a boy watching his father work. Young technicians trained under one principle above all: find the root cause before reaching for the expensive fix. Priya became one of the first engineers to complete the program, eventually leading a small team of her own. Kessler Aviation rebuilt investor trust slowly by staying transparent about what went wrong and reforming how major decisions got approved. Vanessa kept her sharp instincts, but she learned to listen, genuinely listen, to voices from the lowest levels of the company. At a small, deliberately understated ceremony in the same hangar, Walter told the staff that the future of aviation depended not on the most expensive technology available, but on people humble enough to notice small failures before they became disasters. Vanessa thanked Daniel publicly that day, careful this time not to turn him into a symbol for the company's recovery. She called him a partner who'd saved Kessler Aviation from its own arrogance, a description far more honest than anything a press release could produce. Daniel watched the G650 lift into a clear afternoon sky, climbing steady, no warning light in sight. He felt no need for vindication. The truth, quietly acknowledged, had always been enough. The lesson of that single, impossible day stayed with everyone who'd stood in that hangar the morning the aircraft refused to start. Price was never the true measure of worth. A title never guaranteed wisdom. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one who ever truly sees what matters. If stories like this keep you here until the very last word, the ones where quiet competence finally gets seen, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and stay close for the next one.